They didn't just think I was a failure. That night, my family made sure everyone at my brother's engagement dinner knew it. I sat quietly at the table, napkin on my knees, while my father laughed about my lost years. My brother smirked and my mother nodded like it was fact. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Then his fiancé leaned closer and whispered, "Wait." The room went still. Even my mother froze. Before I tell you what happened next, tap like, comment where you're listening from, and share if your family ever underestimated you, because that silence changed everything in that exact moment. My name is Lauren Hayes, and in my family, names only mattered if they came with titles people could brag about. Realtor, broker, investor, anything that sounded solid, predictable, and profitable. My name did. It floated around the table like background noise, acknowledged only when someone needed a contrast. The engagement dinner was held in a private room downtown, the kind with dark wood walls and soft lighting meant to make everyone look successful. White tablecloths, heavy silverware, a server refilling glasses before anyone asked. My parents loved places like this. They believed the room you sat in said more about you than anything you could explain. I was seated 2 chairs away from my brother, close enough to hear every quiet joke, far enough to be left out of the center. He looked relaxed, confident, already practicing the role of future patriarch. People leaned toward him when they spoke, laughed a little harder. My parents watched him with the same expression they'd worn my entire life when they talked about him. Relief mixed with pride. No one asked me how I was. Not really. When someone did glance my way, my mother filled the space before I could answer. "Lauren's still figuring things out," she said gently, like she was smoothing a wrinkle only she could see. My father added something about patience, about how not everyone was built for real pressure. They smiled as if they were being generous. I focused on the table instead, the way the candle flickered, the faint smell of charred steak and pepper, the hum of conversations bleeding in from the dining room outside. These details grounded me. I'd learned a long time ago that if I stayed still enough, people would talk as if I wasn't there. My brother's fiancée sat across from me. She didn't dominate the table. She observed it. When my parents spoke, she listened without interrupting. When my brother talked about work, she asked questions that made him slow down. Her eyes moved carefully, taking in tone more than words. At one point, my father joked about how different my path had been. The table laughed politely. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that came from being turned into a story someone else controlled. I didn't correct him. I didn't defend myself. Silence had become my reflex, not because I was weak, but because I was tired of explaining a life no one wanted to understand. What no one at that table knew was that this wasn't just another dinner for me. It was a test of how long I could sit in a room built to exclude me, and what would happen if someone finally noticed the cracks. My name had always come last in conversations about success. Not announced, not celebrated, just appended like a footnote no one expected to read. That night at the restaurant wasn't new. It was simply louder. As my brother talked about his future plans, my parents leaned in, nodding at every sentence. My father added commentary, embellishing details, turning ordinary achievements into heroic stories. My mother smiled the way she always did when she believed she was presenting a perfect family to the world. Every so often, one of them glanced in my direction just long enough to remind me I was still part of the picture, barely. Their words carried me backward. A few months earlier, I'd opened my phone to see photos online from a gathering at my parents' house. A networking night, drinks on the patio, people in tailored jackets standing near the pool laughing. I hadn't been invited. When I asked my mother about it later, she sounded surprised that I'd noticed. She said it was very technical and she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, as if being excluded was a kindness. Then there was the holiday barbecue. The heat, the smell of charcoal, paper plates bending under food. I'd been talking to someone near the fence when my father's voice rose above the music. He was bragging again about my brother, about the business, about legacy. Then he laughed and mentioned me, not with pride, with amusement. People smiled awkwardly. Someone patted my arm like I'd lost something important, and everyone knew it. Back at the dinner table, my brother lifted his glass and made a comment about how not everyone takes the traditional route. He said it casually, like an observation, but his eyes flicked toward me, a reminder, a line drawn. I felt the familiar pressure behind my ribs, the urge to speak, to correct the story, to say something sharp enough to make them stop. Instead, I took a slow breath and folded my hands tighter. I'd learned that reacting only gave them more control. Silence at least belonged to me. The worst part wasn't the jokes. It was the offers. My brother once called me before the engagement. Dinner voice soft concerned. He asked if I needed help buying something appropriate to wear. Said he didn't want me to feel embarrassed. The implication was clear. I was the problem that needed managing. At the table, my mother leaned toward my brother's fiancé and spoke about my future like it was an unresolved inconvenience. She talked about stability, about how someone might take care of me one day. Her hand rested on my shoulder, light but possessive. That was the moment something shifted. I didn't look up right away. I focused on the sound of my heartbeat, steady and controlled. All those nights working alone, all the calls I couldn't talk about, all the decisions I'd made without anyone's approval. They thought my quiet meant uncertainty. They thought my patience meant dependence. Across the table, my brother's fiancé was no longer smiling. He was watching, really watching. And for the first time that night, I had the unmistakable sense that the story they'd been telling about me was about to run out of room. I didn't flinch when my mother's hand stayed on my shoulder a second too long. I didn't look at my brother when he nodded like the matter of my future had been neatly resolved. Outwardly, I stayed exactly the same, calm, still agreeable. Inside, something finally settled into place. The truth was, my life had never been as uncertain as they believed. It just didn't look like theirs. While my parents hosted dinners and talked loudly about growth and reputation, my days ran on a different clock. Early mornings blurred into nights. My apartment stayed quiet except for the low hum of my laptop fan and the occasional buzz of a call coming in from a different time zone. I learned to measure progress in small confirmations, signed documents, cleared payments, short messages that said, "We're moving forward." There was no applause, no audience, just momentum. I never talked about it, not because I was ashamed but because I couldn't. The work demanded silence. Agreements were still fragile. One loose word could undo months of preparation. So, when my family offered help, money advice, I smiled and declined. Letting them underestimate me was safer than correcting them. That night at the restaurant, as conversation flowed around me, I realized how deeply they'd mistaken restraint for weakness. They saw my rented apartment as proof I'd failed. They saw my simple clothes as surrender. They didn't see the discipline it took to live quietly while building something that couldn't afford distractions. My brother leaned back in his chair, satisfied. My father ordered another round. My mother talked about future holidays, already planning who would sit where. They were comfortable, certain. I felt the shift before anything was said. Across the table, my brother's fiancée had stopped engaging with the family's stories. Her gaze returned to me again and again, thoughtful, focused. She wasn't listening to the words anymore. She was watching the pauses, the moments when I chose not to speak, the way I didn't rush to defend myself. I'd seen that look before on calls where people realized they'd made the wrong assumptions. For the first time all evening, I let myself breathe a little deeper. Not because I expected rescue, not because I needed validation, but because I understood something they didn't control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. The dinner continued, but the balance had already changed. My parents were still talking, still performing. My brother was still confident. Yet there was a growing tension beneath the surface, like a quiet wire pulled too tight. I stayed seated. I stayed silent. Not because I had nowhere else to be, but because I knew exactly when it would matter to stand up. The server returned with another round of drinks, setting the glasses down carefully, unaware that the air at the table had shifted. My father raised his glass first, eager to regain control of the room. To family, he said, smiling wide, and to new beginnings. Everyone echoed him except me. I lifted my glass a second later, just enough not to stand out. I'd learned how to survive moments like this by staying half a beat behind. My brother launched into another story about his plans. Bigger house, bigger responsibilities, bigger future. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. My parents filled in the gaps for him, interrupting each other, polishing every sentence until it gleamed. "And Lauren," my father added, suddenly waving his hand in my direction like he'd remembered a detail late. "Well, she's always been independent." The pause before that word was deliberate. My mother laughed softly. "She likes doing things her own way." She said, "The way people talk about stubborn habits they hope will pass. We just want her to be secure. You know how hard the world is." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the reflex to shrink. I kept my eyes on the table, the grain of the wood, a faint scratch near my plate. Anything solid. Across from me, my brother's fiancée didn't look away. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if a thought had just clicked into place. Then she asked calmly, "Len, what exactly do you do?" The question landed differently than the others. It wasn't casual. It wasn't polite filler. It was direct. Before I could answer, my brother chuckled. "It's complicated," he said quickly. "Some tech thing she's been experimenting." My father nodded, relieved to take over. "Lots of people try those kinds of things. It's a tough space." I felt heat rise in my neck. So I said nothing. The fiancé didn't smile. "What kind of platform?" she asked, eyes still on me. The table went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. My parents shifted. My brother cleared his throat. "She's modest," my mother said, touching my arm again. "She doesn't like to talk about it." That was when the fiancé leaned in, slightly lowering her voice. Not enough to be secret, but enough to change the tone. "Is it logistics related?" she asked me. I looked up for the first time in minutes. "Yes," I said, one word, calm, steady. Her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Global," she continued. I nodded. My brother laughed again, a little too loudly. "See, this is what I mean. Very vague." The fiancé ignored him. Her attention sharpened. "Professional now. Supply chain optimization." I felt my pulse slow. "Yes." The silence thickened. She exhaled slowly, eyes never leaving mine. Then she murmured just loud enough for the table to hear. "Wait here." She stopped herself mid-sentence. The effect was immediate. Conversation died. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Even the server a few tables away seemed to hesitate. It felt like the entire room had taken one breath and forgotten how to release it. My father frowned. "What is it?" he asked, irritation creeping in. The fiancée straightened in her chair. "Loren Hayes," she said carefully. "You're Unct the founder, aren't you?" No one spoke. I met her gaze and gave a small nod. The sound my brother made wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a gasp. Founder of what he demanded. She didn't answer him. She reached into her bag instead and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with practiced ease. When she turned it around, the headline filled the space between us. An article, industry focused. No photos of me, just analysis, numbers, quotes from investors praising a founder who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. She slid the phone toward the center of the table. "This," she said evenly, "is one of the most closely watched platforms in the sector right now. Quiet launch, strong early traction, international reach." My father leaned forward, squinting. My mother's smile had vanished completely. "We've been trying to get a meeting for months," the fiancé continued. "No press, no interviews, just results." My brother shook his head. "That's not." He stopped when he realized no one was listening. She looked at him then finally. "You said you wanted me to meet visionaries," she said. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was worse. It was controlled. I didn't expect one to be sitting across from me. The room stayed frozen. My mother's hand slid off my shoulder like it had burned her. Her mouth opened then closed. She tried again, but no words came out. My father's straightened, color draining from his face. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. The edge in his voice dulled by confusion. I didn't answer right away. I picked up my glass, took a small sip and set it down carefully. "You never asked," I said. My brother stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "If this was true, we would have known." The fiancé's eyes flicked back to her phone. "The whole point was that you didn't," she said. Something in my brother's expression cracked. Not anger, fear. Around us. The restaurant noise slowly crept back, but our table remained isolated like we were encased in glass. People were staring now, whispering. I felt oddly detached, calm in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't hide it to prove anything. I said, my voice steady. I hid it because I didn't need approval. My father swallowed. My mother stared at the tablecloth, fingers clenched tight. I stood smoothing my napkin before placing it beside my plate. The movement felt ceremonial, final. "I should go," I said, glancing at the fiancé. "It was nice to meet you," she nodded once, respect clear in her expression. I didn't look at my family again. I didn't need to. As I walked out of the private room, the silence followed me. Not the familiar silence of dismissal. This one was heavy, uncomfortable, earned. Behind me no one spoke. And for the first time in my life, that silence felt like justice. I didn't rush when I left the restaurant. The night air felt cooler than it should have, brushing against my skin like a reset. I walked a block before stopping, letting the noise fade behind me. My phone buzzed once in my hand. I didn't look at it. For years, I'd imagined this moment ending with shouting or apologies. Instead, it ended with nothing. And somehow that was heavier. In the days that followed, the silence held. No family group messages, no carefully worded texts pretending nothing had happened. When my mother finally called, her voice was unsteady. She asked questions that sounded more like attempts to regain footing than genuine curiosity. I answered politely, briefly. I didn't fill the gaps for her anymore. My brother never reached out. I heard through someone else that the engagement dinner became awkward in retellings. The story edited to protect pride. I let it be rewritten. I didn't need credit. I needed distance. What surprised me most was how light everything felt once I stopped carrying their expectations. My work continued. Calls, decisions, progress. Nothing had changed there. What changed was the quiet inside me, the constant bracing, the urge to prove something to people who had already decided who I was. I realized then that resolution doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like clarity, like knowing where you end and where other people's opinions begin. I didn't lose my family that night. I lost the version of myself that kept shrinking to fit into there, and I didn't miss her at all. I used to think being accepted by my family would finally make me feel whole. Now I know that understanding myself mattered more than earning a seat at their table. That night didn't change who I was, it revealed it. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to see you best, you're not alone. Share where you're listening from and tell me what helped you stand your ground. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next video.